Hope lunch was good. Hope it was better than mine. There was none. We ran out of time. We actually wanted to have sound and music to the photos, but so we just made it a photo collage. These are photos that we have in the photo archives at the Fray Angélico Chávez History Library, History Photo Archives. We just ran out of time to put music on.
Yes, Father, oh gosh, I can't put his name. Yeah, that's the one who lived in.
That's Ignatius Brady. That's another novice with him. Wow. Who is an incredible scholar also. Really? Yeah. They were classmates and they were good friends. Wow. Jack. Sticking down the ground. That indicates they were in the novitiate. I wonder, okay. They were novices. Okay, that one.
Oh.
Wait a minute, they're still coming. We got
Okay, can you turn it on again? We'll wait for 5 minutes. That's apparently in the library. Did you say that? Yeah. Okay. Where are the books? Do I have Tom just mentioned my office. I have a very nice office, but when Tom was the director, I called it once my office, and he almost ripped my head off because it was the rear book room. And since Tom left, it is now my office and the rear book room. So, and the library, let me plug the library while we are looking at the photos. The library is open Tuesday through Fridays, 1 to 5. Even if you have no research agenda, it is really a very nice room to just come in and look at the room, look at the library. We also have once a month a lunch lecture. If anybody is interested, you can email me your email address and I put you on my list. It's once a month. I basically get people whose arms I can twist. That's basically my friends, my colleagues. This morning we had Supreme Court Justice Cerner here. He came in for last year for some family history, and he walked out as a lecturer for me on Billy the Kid. Anyone, you can have a copy. Yes, they are in the history library. All these. Oh, yeah, that's even easier. That's burning it. So, can we turn it off now? Without getting a revolt? Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me now to great pleasure to introduce Melina Vizcaino Aleman. First of all, I would like to congratulate her to her Ph.D. that she got this week. So, and I also like to introduce Melina and speakers like Melina because they do research in our library. Usually, people come to the library, they take their information, and they go away. Best intentions to write that book or that article, never do, I don't know. But with Melina, she spent hours and weeks in the library reading Angélico Chávez's books, manuscripts, and I could call her back to give us her findings, read from her findings. And also what I like, Nazario is not here, Tom, doesn't matter. We get some younger people, younger generation of academics and historians interested in Fray Angélico Chávez. Melina got her Ph.D. at O.F.M. in American Studies. She did research in the Chavez Library, in the Center for Southwest Research at O.F.M. She discovered Fray Angélico's letters to John Gould Fletcher, another poet and Pulitzer Prize winner, at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville. And she wrote her dissertation about the importance of religion as a mode of representation in Fray Angélico's and other Southwest writers' works. Among her publications so far are encyclopedia entries, articles, book reviews on Fray Angélico, and one on, we just published that, on Nazario's book. And she also received in 2009 the New Mexico State Historians Fellowship. Melina will talk to us about Fray Angélico's critical regionalism. Thank you very much. And I'll get you a water. Good.
I just want to thank Tomas and the Museum of New Mexico for inviting me out here to participate with. I feel very honored to be sitting among the distinguished scholars and people who are participating. So I am going to be talking about Fray Angélico's critical regionalism, and it is part of my larger study of him, my dissertation, like a 250-page manuscript that I've condensed to maybe 10 pages. So hopefully, excuse me? How about?
Man, it went so good so far.
I'll just talk louder.
Yeah, okay.
Okay? So, Fray Angélico Chávez is remembered in many different ways. As the morning session of this symposium demonstrates, he was a priest, historian, brother, uncle, and storyteller. For myself, the youngest panelist participating in this symposium, and the least experienced and least known, I can only honor his memory through my knowledge of his writings and his archives. Unlike others here who knew Fray Angélico professionally or personally, I came to know him as a researcher and a scholar. Thus, I must make clear from the start, the angle from which I present him to you today is a scholarly one. I became familiar with Fray Angélico's work as a master's student taking an autobiography seminar at the University of New Mexico when I came across his book, La Conquistadora, the Autobiography of an Ancient Statue. Never before had I read such a book, and it struck me as odd that a man, and a priest no less, would take the perspective of a statue, and a female one at that, to tell the history of the Catholic Church of New Mexico. My intrigue led to my interest in all of Fray Angélico's writings, and I began collecting first editions of everything he wrote, reading them religiously, and composing a master's thesis. The thesis led to my dissertation, and my dissertation to my doctorate. But I feel I have gained much more from Fray Angélico's writings than 2 advanced degrees. First, I gained knowledge about New Mexico history, but more importantly, I gained a better understanding of the Southwest, its historical archives, and its literary legacies. There are 3 ways to understand Fray Angélico's writings. First, we must account for how his work participated in Southwestern boosterism in the early 20th century. Many scholars have documented this history and given it different names: the Writers' Era, Anglo-Southwesternism, and Triculturalism, just to name a few. In all cases, Pueblo Indians embodied for Anglo-America a pure American past, isolated from urban industrial development and class conflict at the turn of the 20th century. Molly Mullen makes a similar argument in her study of gender relations and the marketing of culture at the turn of the 20th century in Santa Fe. Mullen describes Santa Fe as a refuge for northeastern Anglo women who traveled to the Southwest and made Santa Fe an enclave of cultural investment, or what Mullen calls a city of ladies. Feminist scholars have recovered the female writers and artists who participated in the representation of the Southwestern landscape, most notably Georgia O'Keeffe and Mary Austin. The Southwestern landscape liberated women's creativity and shaped their art, and it allowed them to revise dominant male perceptions of the West, particularly through the appropriation of Pueblo culture and lifestyle. The second way to read Fray Angélico's writings is as an expression of his Hispanic ethnicity. Doctors Alan McCracken and Nazario Garcia, both present today as fellow panelists, have established the second angle of writing. Genaro Padilla makes a similar argument in his 1987 collection of Fray Angélico's short fiction, and more recently, Dr. McCracken develops the reading in the introduction to her 2009 collection of his unpublished stories, which I'm sure is available for purchase for anyone who's interested. And she also just came out with his biography in December. Both of them excellent pieces of history and recovery. Now I lost my place, because that wasn't part of my talk. Padilla uses the idea of double consciousness to characterize Fray Angélico's writings. He says that on the surface, the stories appeased Anglo readers of the time who expected quaint depictions of New Mexico village life, made popular by the aforementioned Southwestern boosterism. In this sense, Fray Angélico appeals to a tourist audience. Beneath the surface, however, there is a second mode of storytelling that expresses a Hispanic cuento or oral tradition. The second level of reading understands Fray Angélico's writings as the product of a Hispanic New Mexican, meaning his cultural heritage cannot be separated from his regional identity. Thus, his writings have a double voice in which he inserts the importance of his Hispanic ethnic identity within the region's Anglo-driven boosterism. Finally, the third way to read Fray Angélico's writings is through a religious lens. Father Jack Clark Robinson, also a panelist here today, who I just had the pleasure to meet, argues that we must understand Fray Angélico as, first and foremost, a Franciscan person. I agree, and for this reason I choose to address him by his religious name, Fray Angélico, which was also his pen name. In fact, I argue that Fray Angélico's Franciscanism mediates the Anglo-Southwestern and Hispanic ethnic traditions of the time. As a clerical student at Duns Scotus College in Michigan, Fray Angélico wrote his BA thesis in 1933 on the importance of religious art as quote-unquote a third ingredient that balanced the material and spiritual worlds of a Franciscan student. By extension, his Franciscanism balances the doubleness that characterizes his writings. In this way, Fray Angélico's writings are not simply a product of the region's boosterism, and they are more than an example of his Hispanic ethnicity. Following his own scholarly logic, there is a religious third ingredient to his work, and it creates what I call critical regionalism. What I mean by critical is that his religion offers a third lens through which to read his work. For some, it is enough to read the surface narrative of his writing. Others prefer the Hispanic component. But I present to you a third way that balances the two in a way that accounts for the relationship between religion, ethnicity, and region. For instance, Fray Angélico's Franciscanism was a formal institution tied directly to his sense of self as a Spanish American and a regional writer. Of course, he served as a Pueblo missionary father, a Hispanic village pastor, and an American military chaplain. But his service among the natives to New Mexico extended beyond the Southwest, where he also served the natives of Guam and Leyte in World War II as an Army chaplain. In a December 15, 1942 letter to his Franciscan superior in Cincinnati, Ohio, he explained that he was recruited in the U.S. Army because he was Spanish American and a potential diplomatic link between the U.S. and Latin America. He was like many other Mexican American soldiers at the time who served in the armed services, but his religious mission distinguished him from the rest of the U.S.'s Spanish-speaking soldiery. His letters to his Franciscan superiors during his World War II duty demonstrate his commitment to his Pacific missions. And at one point, he even contemplated moving permanently to a remote island to live out his Franciscan vocational promise. It never happened, but he did express an interest. During this time, he penned the poems from his second collection of poetry, 11 Lady Lyrics, which was published in 1947. He dedicated his lyrics to the Virgin Mary, a medieval tradition that reinforced his Franciscan faith and transmitted it to a modern world, reeling from warfare and mass destruction. At the same time, he inserted himself and the Spanish-speaking soldiers he served with in the nation's war and its presence across the globe. In the context of New Mexico, Fray Angélico's work among the Pueblos was foundational to his representation of the Southwest, but in a way that was quite different from the representation made popular during the Spanish Pueblo revival era. This era, as I noted before, renewed women's writings and creativity in a secular realm. By contrast, Fray Angélico engaged in Pueblo culture from a religious standpoint. His Franciscanism gave him a different location from which to view Pueblo culture, one that reinforced the regional authenticity of Anglo writings, while at the same time it brought forth a religious perspective of Pueblo life. Fray Angélico began serving as a mission priest to the Cochiti, Santo Domingo, and San Felipe Pueblos in 1937, but he began experimenting with Pueblo performance as early as 1929, so as to forge his own Hispanic and religious identity while away from the region. Allow me to demonstrate with one 1929 story entitled Spanish and Irish, which, according to Dr. McCracken, he wrote while studying at the novitiate in Mount Airy, Cincinnati. In the story, Fray Angélico stages a competition between two young women, Lupe Ortiz and Rose Morey, one Hispanic and one Irish. Both girls want the lead role in their school play, so they devise a way to settle their feud fairly by disguising themselves so as to outwit the other. The two agree to meet by a bridge in the Archbishop's garden, a metaphoric setting that suggests the meeting of opposites. As the story begins, the two girls are on opposite sides of a fence, but the story mediates their differences through the performance of Pueblo identity. Lupe dresses up as a, quote, typical Santa Clara Indian woman, buxom and brown, like the many squaws that roamed the streets, end quote. But she never makes it to the bridge, and instead hides behind a tree when she sees a quote-unquote real Indian brave sitting on the corner smoking a cigarette. As it turns out, the real Indian brave is none other than Rose, who wins the contest, for she not only disguises herself, but she ups the game by dressing as a Pueblo man and thus fooling Lupe in the process. On the surface, Spanish and Irish tells a playful story about performance in disguise, but as Dr. McCracken points out, the story merges Lupe's perspective with the narrator's perspective in order to fool readers. The fake performance also seems to comment on the story's own perspective, which allows readers of the St. Anthony Messenger, the magazine in which it was first published, to identify with the Hispanic girl and, by extension, her Hispanic author. In 1929, the year in which the story was published, the writer's era was burgeoning in New Mexico. So the performance of Pueblo identity is also a commentary on the regional representation occurring at the time, particularly at the hands of white women who, symbolically at least, took up Pueblo myths and oral traditions that were traditionally passed on by Pueblo men. Lupe does not distinguish the real Indian from the fake performance, but perhaps the deeper implication of the story is that the narrator, Fray Angélico himself, was forging his own mode of storytelling through his religious vocation and traditions of the Southwest. After all, the two girls attend a Catholic academy, and their performance takes place in the Archbishop's garden, though Lupe never makes it to the bridge, perhaps to suggest that Fray Angélico only partially participated in the authentic performances of Native identity in his stories. In this way, the story serves as a vehicle for Fray Angélico's Southwestern critical regionalism. The number 3 is central to Catholicism and the representation of Catholic beliefs, particularly as it relates to the notion of trinal triplicity and the Holy Trinity. Fray Angélico tells a story from a third-person perspective, but Lupe and Rose also agree to meet each other at 3 o'clock, a narrative choice that reinforces the story's religious significance. Also, there are 2 characters in the story, but the narrative voice suggests that a third character, the author himself, is just as important to the outcome. The performance of Native identity distinguishes between the Spanish and Irish girls, even as it connects them. For Lupe's performance forges Fray Angélico's own Hispanic identity, while the story itself inscribes his religious faith in the region. Fray Angélico's service among the New Mexico Pueblo peoples would reinforce his distinction from Anglo writers, as well as his Hispanic identity and Franciscanism. For instance, in his 1948 poem, The Single Rose, Poems of Divine Love, he meditates on his spiritual growth through the metaphor of a rose. The collection is an extended meditation on the poet's struggle to attain a holy life in the midst of a material world. As the inside flap explains, the book began in Spanish, quote, purely as a lark, in the fashion of 15th century writers, and in a less serious vein. But when their author began translating himself into English, the latter ran away with him, so that only the prologue in Spanish survived, end quote. Fray Angélico pays homage to the Spanish mystic poets Sor Teresa de Ávila and Juan de la Cruz. And he appends a commentary to the poem in which he interprets the lyrics from the perspective of Fray Manuel, his birth name, as the poem's secondary title makes evident. And the secondary title is The Rosa Única and Commentary of Fray Manuel de Santa Clara. The secondary title suggests that Fray Manuel is a native informant, speaking from the heart of indigenous New Mexico, the Santa Clara Pueblo. So the title repositions Fray Angélico in the Southwest after his World War II deployment overseas. Yet, he never served as a missionary priest to the Santa Clara Pueblo, so he may just as well be referring to his religious order as much as to the regional locale. The English translation of Santa Clara, after all, means Saint Clare, the name of Saint Francis's first female religious disciple, who founded a second Franciscan order in Assisi. Recall that Lupe disguises herself as a Santa Clara woman in Spanish and Irish, so it was already a significant gender performance in Fray Angélico's writings. In light of his Franciscan personality, Santa Clara has 2 meanings, one regional and one religious, and together they forge a critical regionalism that I find characteristic of all of Fray Angélico's writings. Fray Angélico's service as a World War II Army chaplain is a significant juncture in his lifelong work, for it staged a shift in his writings toward historical recovery, but his wartime experience also expanded his sense of the region and religious service. By the end of World War II, Fray Angélico's writings encompassed a global consciousness. His wartime experiences especially informed the last story in his 1957 collection, From an Altar Screen, The Colonel and the Santo, which is set outside of Los Alamos in the Santa Clara Valley. And again, the significance of that name, not only as a location, as I argue. The colonel and an army chaplain drive across the valley to the home of a fallen soldier, Cash Atencio, to notify his mother of his death in Japan. The name Cash puzzles the chaplain, who otherwise speaks authoritatively about the region and its Spanish-American people. And at one point, he even corrects the colonel when he refers to Cash as Mexican. Quote, "It is only here in New Mexico that some people can think Mexican," says the chaplain, and at the same time pronounce the altogether distinct word Spanish, end quote. For the colonel, The priest's words go some way towards explaining Cash's irresponsible outbursts. And he proceeds to tell the story of how Cash perished in Japan. As the two military persons drive past a blue mesa resembling, quote, some gigantic elephant, the colonel speaks for the first time in 20 minutes, saying that the mesa reminds him, quote, of another bluff on a far Pacific island, as well as the one purpose of this his first visit to New Mexico, end quote. As it turns out, Cash perished at the foot of a mountain bluff that the colonel's quote-unquote Mexican soldiers called Elephant Butte, a reference to New Mexico's landscape and Fray Angélico's way of suggesting how local soldiers found comfort in their foreign surroundings while fighting overseas. And of course, Elephant Butte is a popular recreational lake. It's south of Albuquerque near Truth or Consequences. The closer the chaplain and the colonel get to the Atencio home, the more the colonel opens up about his wartime experiences as they drive through the northern New Mexican landscape. When the colonel sees an image of a crucified figure in the Atencio home in military uniform, he exclaims, "That's the strangest way of dressing Christ on the cross." The chaplain explains, "That is not Christ on the cross, sir, but the figure of a once very popular saint in New Mexico by the name of San Acacio." Acacio! That explains Cash's name. I bet you anything it was his grandfather's name and his father's name, end quote. There is a strange resemblance, as the colonel explains, between Cash's crucified body in Japan and the Santo's crucified image in the Atencio home. When the colonel asks the chaplain not to tell Cash's mother how he discovered the soldier's body, it is already too late, for he tells her in Spanish. Instead of breaking down, the mother thanks the colonel, takes a ribboned medal from his helpless fingers, and pins it to San Acacio's heart. Fastening her son's military ribbon to the saint's crucified body connects the Southwest and its folk religious traditions to the military-industrial complex in the state. Here, the colonel and the santo makes evident how religious understanding explains the connection between the southwestern landscape and its Hispanic peoples. But the story also demonstrates how Hispanics use religion to understand the landscape of global warfare. Figuratively, the colonel and the santo serves as a form of cultural translation between the story's audience and the New Mexican region. Literally, the chaplain serves as a translator, but symbolically, he is a mediator between the colonel and Cash's mother. While World War II causes the colonel's post-traumatic stress, New Mexico's religious traditions affirm the region's patriotism, and particularly the standing of its Mexican and Spanish-American soldiers in a post-World War II era. The story's military chaplain thus demonstrates how Fray Angélico himself a chaplain, viewed his relationship between his religious service, his Hispanic heritage, and the region. His is not a double voice, but in the vein of the Trinity itself, a triple voice that brings together his Franciscanism, his ethnicity, and his regional homeland. In essence, his southwestern critical regionalism. Thank you.
Is it on? Yeah. Are there any questions? Now that I remember, we should ask that. Thank you, Melina. Thank you. Next is Jack Clark Robinson, and before I introduce him, same welcome, same brand new Ph.D. with Mario Garcia as his mentor, or in German we'd call it Dr. Father. So congratulations. Jack Clark Robinson is now in a station in San Antonio as the director of the post-novitiate formation for the Franciscan province of Our Lady of Guadalupe. After he received a law degree from the University of Kentucky, he joined the Franciscan friars in Cincinnati and basically, to some extent, reversed the trip as Fray Angélico did, from New Mexico to Cincinnati. As Jack pointed out to me, three times he lived in houses where Fray Angélico Chávez lived, and including in the same room from which Fray Angélico left the friars in Peña Blanca. That must have been very nice. Jack published an article of Fray Angélico Chávez, The Roots of Franciscan Priesthood, in Allen's edited book, Fray Angélico Chávez, Poet, Priest, and Artist. His dissertation is entitled The Franciscan Friars of New Mexico, Three Borderland Trails to Vatican II. That was the dissertation at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Jack's talk today is catchy. Life Comes from the Archbishop, Robert Sanchez and Fray Angélico Chávez.
On June 30th, 1971, Fray Angélico Chávez, in his own words, retired from the Franciscan order. While the rest of the friars in the house slept, he drove away from the friary in Peña Blanca, leaving a note on the bulletin board about where to pick up the car which he drove to Santa Fe. On Christmas Eve, 1976, Fray Angélico celebrated the midnight Mass at St. Francis Cathedral. In between those two moments, Robert Sanchez, first as a priest and then as Archbishop of Santa Fe, perhaps more than any other single person, kept Fray Angélico the priest connected to the official Roman Catholic Church. What follows here is the story of that connection, drawn primarily from extensive interviews which I was privileged to have with Archbishop Sanchez, as well as from numerous other sources. Fray Angélico's departure from the Franciscans came at the height of the time when men were leaving the Catholic priesthood and both men and women were leaving religious life. The Second Vatican Council of 1963 to 1965 began as the attempt of Pope Blessed John XXIII to open the windows of the Church to let in fresh air. But by the time Pope Paul VI concluded the council, the 1960s had become tumultuous. The fresh air good Pope John had longed for soon became a raging whirlwind, not only for the Church, but politically, socially, culturally, around the world. By the early 1970s, the full effects of change seemed ready to break down walls rather than open windows. Political colonialism had been thoroughly discredited around the world, and in the United States, the civil rights struggles of African Americans were broadening to include Latinos and Native Americans. Socially, the roles of silence and obedience once assigned to women and youth were under challenge, while the closet door in front of gay men and lesbians had cracked open. Culturally, it was a bad time for authority figures of all sorts. The winds of change saw the numbers of Catholic religious women in the United States drop by 50,000 from their all-time high of 176,000 in 1968 to 126,000 in 1980. The drop in the numbers of priests took longer, but the trend was downward after 1968 as well, so that almost 60,000 U.S. priests in 1968 became 53,111 in 1990. Fray Angélico did not leave the priesthood alone. But Fray Angélico's departure from a religious life and active ministry as a Catholic priest, like the departures of thousands of others, was an individual story too. In his case, as Ellen McCracken has carefully shown in the life and writings of Fray Angélico Chávez, years of pent-up frustration and hurts endured for decades went into his decision to retire from the Franciscan order and the Church. No little part of that frustration and those hurts had to do with prejudices which Fray Angélico perceived and endured due to his Hispanic heritage. In February 1971, Fray Angélico addressed Padres, a newly emerging group of Latino priests. He sought to express his concern about the historically second-class treatment of Hispanics within both secular society and the Catholic Church in the United States. One early member of Padres, or Priests Associated for Religious, Educational, and Social Rights, was the then pastor of San Felipe de Neri Parish in Albuquerque, Robert Fortune Sanchez. Robert Fortune Sanchez, the first native New Mexican and first Hispanic American named Archbishop of Santa Fe, very generously and graciously spoke to me extensively in interviews on the 24th and 25th of May in 2008. He described the situation as he recalled it in New Mexico in 1971, and of how the organization Padres had sought to bring about change. Quote, "There was a lot of reaction around the country with regard to justice. The blacks were threatening to burn the cities. In fact, Chicago got burned, and Albuquerque got it, not bad. Through our Padres, we were able to undo a prepared march on the city and the jail to burn it down because of the injustices they thought had been. But anyway, what we did at that time, from 71 on, was to make ourselves aware of these things." Close quote. Sanchez and many other priests in New Mexico were concerned not only about social justice, but also about issues of cultural identity, which would have been of more direct concern to Fray Angélico. The Archbishop continued, quote, "We had to not only become alerted to what was happening, but we would try to promote more singing in the church, Spanish hymns, and we began to introduce the Christmas posadas. We never had posadas like that, so now we were introducing them. In Mexico they had them, of course. We had long ago let go of them in New Mexico. We started at the University of New Mexico. That was the first place that we started to revive it. Then we went down to San Felipe. Then the next year to other places. All of those, what I would call celebrations of culture, we were going to promote and revive in order to keep the faith strong for the people." Close quote. No one would ever doubt that Fray Angélico had a concern for keeping the Catholic faith strong among his fellow Hispanics of New Mexico and within himself. But a strong faith did not necessarily mean a strong tie to the organizational church. In my Penitente land, Fray Angélico spoke of the Mexican era of New Mexico history, that time from 1821 to 1846, when Mexican independence meant the forced departure of some Franciscan friars and the failure of diocesan priests to take their place. Though official representatives of the church were few, the faith remained. He wrote, quote, the deep feeling of Catolicismo remains as strong as ever, thanks to the language and the landscape. But with its sole remaining element of penitencia, it is generally reduced to a pitiful reliance on such peripheral manifestations as can be found in the miraculous dust of Chimayo and the blood-letting rites of the penitentes. Close quote. In what Fray Angélico wrote here, two thoughts resound. First, the Catholicism of New Mexicans will not cease with the absence of the organized hierarchical church. But second, at the same time, the absence of the church will also lead to something growing disproportionate and out of joint in the lives of the people. He could not be happy with that, as for far too much of his life was devoted to the restoring of the fullness of the historical record. For Fray Angélico to ever be content that something partial took the place of the full measure of Catholicism. No doubt he saw the mistreatment of Hispanics, himself included, by the Catholic Church as a denial of part of their birthright. He was angry. In his own life, his departure from the Franciscans and the ministerial priesthood did not mean that Fray Angélico ceased to be Catholic, but part of who he had been for decades was gone. Though he might well have enjoyed his freedom, there were some things about which he was and would remain angry. One of those who would and did reach out to him at this point in his life was a fellow Hispanic, a native New Mexican, a priest. At the time that Angélico Chávez departed from the Franciscan community, Robert Sanchez was a priest of the Archdiocese of Santa Fe and pastor of San Felipe de Neri Parish in Old Town, Albuquerque. In 2008, Archbishop Sanchez recalled what happened then. Quote, he, Angélico, had separated from the order, and I didn't know what or how, but all I knew is that he was no longer practicing with the community. So I asked him, well, what do you do? Well, I'm looking for some work. His work with the New Mexico magazine was small and didn't help him much. I said, I tell you what, would you like to teach a class at St. Joseph's College? He said, yeah, I teach the history of New Mexico or something. So I spoke with the Sister Superior over there, and I said, I have a priest who can give you an excellent class if you wish to. In fact, it did work out. They went ahead and employed him for one class a week. And I said, Angélico, don't have anything on your schedule for lunch on Wednesdays. I want you to come here for lunch. He didn't have any money. So he said, okay. And I said that I have a lot of questions to ask you about history. And that was a lot of baloney. So we had breakfast every week on Wednesday. Not breakfast, but noon, after his class. And so that went on for I don't know how many months. And he was feeling better. He was surviving better. Close quote. So began an extraordinary ministry of reconciliation. The extraordinary efforts of Robert Sanchez to help Fray Angélico continued for the rest of his life. On the 4th of June, 1974, Sanchez was named 10th Archbishop of Santa Fe, even on the day he was named Archbishop, he thought of Fray Angélico and later remembered, quote, "Then my call came to be the Archbishop of Santa Fe. And I said, the day I am told, that morning I said, good grief. That afternoon, no, that evening, I called him. I said, Angélico? He said, yes, Roberto. I said, I know what I want to do. I said to Angélico, I will give you X number of dollars if you will publish a book for the 100th anniversary of our diocese. Actually, the next year, 1975, was the centennial of Santa Fe becoming an archdiocese, including all of the parishes and all of the priests and pictures. He said, great, I know exactly what you want. So he did. He wrote all of that up, prepared it, and got all the information he needed, got pictures for all of the priests and pictures for all of the different places. I gave a copy to the Pope and to Mother Teresa. He was so proud of that. Anyway, I told him, it's coming back. Your hands are made for writing. He says, I don't know what to say. I said, don't say anything. Listen. I want you to become our director for our archives. As of today, I want you to be the archivist, but I don't want to hear from you for a month because I'm going crazy over here. Close quote. Thanks to the assistance of Marina Ochoa, the director of the Archives and Historic Patrimony for the Archdiocese of Santa Fe since 1983, which, by the way, means that she has now worked in the archives even longer than her famous predecessor. I can tell you that Fray Angélico served as the official director of the archives from 1975 until 1982. The Archbishop had extended a material lifeline to Fray Angélico, which would serve to keep him afloat as he negotiated the tricky financial waters of living independently in the world for the first time in his life. The Archbishop was also giving him meaningful work and providing a perfect venue for him to continue his historic research. As Archbishop Sanchez extended these material and mental lifelines to Fray Angélico, he also wanted to bring about the healing of his soul. When Fray Angélico left Peña Blanca and the friars in 1971, the very Reverend Roger Hoosier, O.F.M., was the minister provincial of the Franciscans of St. John the Baptist Province. St. John the Baptist Province at that time included the missions in northern New Mexico, so Fray Angélico was under his care. Father Roger wanted to make things right legally and officially between Fray Angélico, the church, and the order. Time and again, the minister provincial offered Fray Angélico the opportunity to leave the order in accordance with church law. Nothing was required but for Fray Angélico to sign the papers, but he would not sign. Though no one has been able to completely ascertain the reason for his refusal, Fray Angélico's refusal to sign the documents was of a piece with the thought that the absence of the official hierarchical church does not mean the end of the Catholic faith among the people. No one in Cincinnati or Rome was going to take away Fray Angélico's Franciscan identity, official or not, as illustrated by his continued use of the name Fray Angélico, rather than reverting to his baptismal name of Manuel Ezequiel or his use of pen names, as he had in his youth. His deeply felt self-identity included being Franciscan. Any attempt to take away his Franciscanism was an attempt to strip him of part of his birthright. He could, would, and did stubbornly resist those attempts, whether he was living in Franciscan community or not, whether he was functioning as a priest or not. Once again, Archbishop Sanchez stepped in to offer an attempt at reconciliation and healing. In 1976, after Fray Angélico had been at work for a while as the archivist of the Archdiocese, the Archbishop sought to have him once more engage in priestly activity too. 32 years later, Archbishop Sanchez recalled, quote, "Then this becomes spiritual. How did it go? Oh yes, it was Christmas Eve, and I decided to go visit him in his little apartment, Christmas Eve. So I went over there around 4 o'clock, and I said, 'Angélico, how are you doing?' 'Fine, fine, Merry Christmas,' all that. Then I said, 'Listen, tonight I have the midnight Mass. I'd like to invite you to be my concelebrant.' He had not concelebrated for 5 or 6 years. 'I don't know, the people,' Angélico, you can't do anything about the people. I said, 'This is the birth of Christ, and I don't care what you say or how you feel, you've got to come. I'll pick you up.' 'No, I'll get a ride. I've got my car.' 'All right. But I want you there at 11:15. He said, 'Why so early?' And I said, 'Because the music is beautiful, and you should listen to it.' He arrived, and I told him how I would have him assist. He said, 'I don't even know if I know what I'm reading anymore.' I told him, 'I will point it out with my finger, then you can read what is there.' And I said, 'At the end, after you've received communion, I want you to sit down and just relax, because you're going to be tired.' We did that. He was swarmed by people, and his niece was playing the organ, Consuelo. She was just in tears. I can't even talk about it without making... That's called resurrection. And I was criticized for it. Letters going to important people in Washington that I'm allowing drunkards at the altar, people who haven't been to confession, and all that nonsense. Well, it upset me. I never worried about it, but I decided that the way to end this would be to invite him to Easter Mass. And he came, and we had Mass together. It was the Saturday night Mass, and I just told him, we are celebrating all that has happened in your life. This is the resurrection as Jesus wants it. Close quote. Consuelo Chavez later recalled that from the choir loft at first, she had not been able to tell who that old priest concelebrating with the Archbishop was. But the Corinne Martinez, who had to make several trips from the choir loft to check on the pasoli on the stove in the rectory kitchen, told her that it was Fray Angélico. For several years, Fray Angélico continued to concelebrate the Eucharist from time to time with Archbishop Sanchez at the cathedral, while living on his own in his little Santa Fe apartment. Over those years, Fray Angélico's health began to decline, And when he took a fall alone in his little apartment, his family and friends became quite concerned. Again, Consuelo Chavez, his niece, recalled, quote, FAC, Fray Angélico Chávez, had taken a fall in his apartment, and my mother was really worried about him. He wouldn't listen to anyone in the family, of course. So Mother asked me to talk to the Archbishop. We knew that FAC would do anything Archbishop Sanchez asked him to do. We thought perhaps he could talk him into moving up to the seminary, where he could be watched over by the nuns that served there. Of course, at that time, he was still driving. I had the opportunity to mention my mother's concern to the Archbishop. He said he would look into it. Well, at the clergy convocation, I ran into Father Crispin Butts and told him what I had told the Archbishop. Next thing I knew, FAC called his brother Francisco Eugenio and told him to get a truck and help him move to the cathedral rectory. Father Crispin said that he told FACs that since he was spending so much time at the friary, he should just move back and save money on rent. Angélico responded that he would take a month to think about it. He called Eugenio the next day. Father Crispin found him a habit, and he began concelebrating with Father Crispin. Close quote. Archbishop Sanchez had realized that the one way to be certain of good care for the elderly priest was to get him to return to community life with the Franciscans. A side note here, I'm not really sure that's the best way to get him taken care of, but anyway. So once again, in the mid-1980s, after the assignment of Father Crispin Butts, O.F.M., as rector of the cathedral and head of the local Franciscan community, the Archbishop went to Fray Angélico, and as he recalled that meeting, it was really rather simple. Quote, I told him, your next step is going to be to wear a habit. And I said, I know you're going to be okay, because they had assigned Father Crispin to the cathedral, and he was all in favor. But what else could I do? I said, you, Father Crispin, meet with him and see if you can get him to wear the garment. I'd like to transfer him over there to the rectory because he's not doing well. He could die any day. Well, Angélico surprised me. He lived a lot longer. But he lived in his habit every day. And he stopped me one day. He said, look at me. You've taken my identity away completely. Here I am, the same old friar in a habit. I said, you look great. Close quote. By the time that Fray Angélico came to live at the Cathedral Friary in December 1989, the Franciscans of New Mexico and Arizona had become a separate province from those headquartered in Cincinnati. In no way would he ever have to leave New Mexico again. He might have joked with Archbishop Sanchez that putting him back in a Franciscan habit had taken away his identity. But in reality, his individuality remained intact, as anyone who met him in those last few years of his life can attest. It may have been the effects of the brain tumor which eventually killed him, of too many drinks with his friends in all of those Santa Fe Plaza restaurants, or simply his weariness from a life of incredible toil. But in his last years, Fray Angélico had about him a disdain for all niceties and most people. He had written of New Mexicans as a people in my Penitente land, and perhaps without realizing it, Fray Angélico had written of himself as well. Quote, he is the product of centuries-long selection by roughest winters and summers, from a series of periods of want, resulting from the skies' inclemency and a history of poverty. As an individual, he will greet you without big courtesies, halting and grave in his movements, and with a self-possession that makes him look like a king dethroned. But this only when he is not being wryly humorous, as in the characters found in Don Quixote. Ordinarily, he is taciturn until his tongue turns loose. Close quote. We can be thankful that for most of us, it was not Fray Angélico's tongue that was turned loose, but his pen and his typewriter. He was often angry, and no doubt often that anger arose from deep pain. I am not certain that for all of his bravado and apparent self-importance, that there was not about him something of a king dethroned, and that he may have had, as so many artists and geniuses do, a real doubt of his own self-worth. The one overwhelming personal memory that I have of Fray Angélico comes from our only long private conversation. In March 1993, I suggested to him that I would like to write about his life, and he totally dismissed the idea, and not with entirely polite words, as well as telling me that he did not want me recording our conversation or taking notes. Fray Angélico did give me a great gift at that time, though, from our bond as Franciscan brothers. One of his classmates in the novitiate, and he is the one that's pictured with Angélico in that picture. One of his classmates in the novitiate and throughout Franciscan formation was Ignatius Brady. Father Ignatius is hardly known outside the Franciscan Academy, but within it, he was enormously respected for a lifetime of work dedicated to making the Franciscan source material of the 13th century, especially the writings of St. Francis and St. Clare, more readily available to the reading public. He co-translated and co-edited a breakthrough volume of the writings of Francis and Clare published in the early 1980s. I asked Fray Angélico if he would autograph my copy of that work, since I had never had the opportunity to ask Father Ignatius, who had died before 1993. He agreed, he said, but only to honor the memory of his dear classmate. Then, to my surprise, he signed his full name, including our O.F.M. initials after it. I have, by the way, a photocopy of that page of the book, and you can, here is where he signed it. I am personally forever thankful to Archbishop Sanchez, to Father Crispin, to his family and his friends, to all who helped keep Fray Angélico alive, and who so honored his very personal and particular commitment to Franciscan life, so that he and I could share that moment. And I believe that we are all indebted to Archbishop Robert Sanchez for all that he did over the last 25 years of Fray Angélico's life, to help him through his roughest moments as he endured his pains and torments, sometimes passing those pains and torments on to others, but nonetheless enduring. For it was from his suffering, his passion, that Fray Angélico has left to all of us and to his dear New Mexico treasures of art, of poetry, of memorable stories and characters, and of history, reimagined to include once forgotten voices and people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you. I met Ellen and Mario probably in my first year on the job. Came with their kids. They played cards in the back. They got noisy when one won too often or lost too often. Got stern looks from the parents. Nope. And 2 years, 3 years later, the kids grew. They came with lists of books to read. They probably got paid for reading them. And towards the end, then, the kids didn't want to come anymore. I remember also both Mario and Ellen doing interviews in, just like that word, vestibule. Does not exist anymore. It was the former entrance to the history library. It was called the vestibule, and that's where they did some of their interviews. So, long way, a long way. Ellen is professor of Spanish language at the University of California in Santa Barbara. She has a Ph.D. from the University of California at San Diego. And her research fields are in Latin American and Chicano, Chicana, or Latino, Latina literature and culture. She published numerous articles on U.S. Latina writers. Some of her books are Decoding Women's Magazines, from Mademoiselle to Ms. Magazine. No, it's a different story. Never mind. Another time. Among the publications, again, that pertain to this event here, she published Fray Angélico Chávez, Poet, Priest, and Artist in 2000, and Guitars and Adobes and Uncollected Stories of Fray Angélico. And as it just came out early this year, I believe, no? December, late last year, in December, the life and writing of Fray Angélico Chávez, a New Mexico Renaissance man, the biography. Ellen will talk about In Search of Fray Angélico Chávez, tracing the life and work of a New Mexico Renaissance man. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here on this beautiful spring day in this dark cavern, but I appreciate your coming. And I also want to give my sincere thanks to Thomas Hahn, is that how you say it, for having organized this. I've never met a better organizer. He started...
I'm German.
I didn't want to say that. But he started this about a year ago and got a grant for it and has covered every base possible so that it got in the newspaper, and a lot of you found out about it that way probably. But I'm so grateful for him to doing this. It's a wonderful tribute to Fray Angélico Chávez. And I want to start with, yes, we should give him a hand, because when else would we do that? Yes. Thank you so much. I want to start with Fabian and Nicolasa Chavez, 100 years ago today, a beautiful spring morning, they had their first child, their first baby boy. They couldn't have been happier. But when I think, as Tom Chavez does, of Wagon Mound, a poor rural community, a very poor family, they couldn't have imagined what this little baby boy would be, what he would become, and that here we are today, 100 years later, celebrating his legacy. There's a statue of him outside, there's a library named after him, and we have a huge amount of books and articles. And so this talk is dedicated to them because they started it all, at least this generation, about 100 years ago. I, as Thomas said, came to New Mexico about 15 years ago, looking to do some work on the Santos for a class I was teaching in Chicana literature. Some of the Chicana writers used that, and I found out about Fray Angélico Chávez's work on the Santos, and I was fascinated and tried to get in touch with him, but the people at the cathedral told me that he was not seeing people. And about a year later, he died, and we happened to be in town because I had organized a session on his work, and it turned out to be a mourning for him 2 days after his death. But Tom Chavez took Mario Garcia, a fellow professor and my husband, with him over to the history library and showed us, he brought out boxes and boxes and boxes of archival material on Fray Angélico Chávez. And Mario said, there's a biography here. He's a historian. And so he and I started to come every summer to New Mexico and study the archives that were here, and we interviewed a large number of people who I'm going to mention in a little while. But I want to put Fray Angélico in the context of a 7-decade career in which he wrote fiction, poetry, plays, essays, spiritual tracts, sermons, historical writing, translation, genealogy, painting, church renovation, and journalism. He became a public intellectual toward the end of his life. He wrote 24 books and over 600 shorter works. And I emphasize in the new book that's come out his complex identity as an ethnic, American, and religious intellectual who was also an artist, a creative writer, and a preservationist. He was the first native New Mexican ordained Franciscan priest in the 3 centuries of Franciscan presence here. It's amazing to think about that. No native New Mexican had been made a priest in those 300 years, more than 300 years. And what I argue in this book is that his religious identity was imbued with his sense of the importance of the history of Hispanos in New Mexico, that you couldn't separate the two. Important American poet John Gould Fletcher wrote to Fray Angélico Chávez and said, what's wonderful about your work is that it's all of a piece. It goes all together in so many ways. And so a couple of examples of how his work coalesced in so many different ways. As he was painting the triptychs of the Stations of the Cross in Peña Blanca, which you saw in the Pasatiempo yesterday, they had some wonderful color pictures of them, he then writes a book of stories in the form of a visual and verbal triptych. And it was published in 1940 called New Mexico Triptych. And then while he was designing the new altar screen for La Conquistadora Chapel in 1954 and 55, he assembled a volume of short stories as if they were figurative panels on an altar screen. So his artistic work was coming together with his fictional writing at the time. And then he hand-painted a photograph of the Our Lady of Light altar screen, which was in the Castrense, the military chapel, and then now is at Cristo Rey Church. And he integrated the saints' images, which were on that altar screen, into this book of fiction that he was writing at the time. He also organized and made discoveries in old church documents, and then he's inspired, because of those discoveries, to revive the cofradia, the confraternity of La Conquistadora, because he discovered that his ancestors were involved in that confraternity 300 years earlier. He saw himself, and I think this is one of the most significant things about his life, he saw himself as continuing the work of the early Franciscan friars, because he was a missionary, he was a record keeper and a documenter of everyday life among the Franciscans. He renovated churches just like the Franciscans built churches. And so his identity was tied up with theirs over the centuries. He was linked. And I argue in the book that he almost became like his fellow friars from 300 years before. He performed the same kind of thing that they did. I also discuss his hybrid identity. Okay, yeah, so we'll get into this famous picture. He emphasized his unique identity as an Hispano despite the predominant melting pot ideology of the times in the U.S. Immigrants were supposed to become Americanized, forget their older cultures and their older customs. And during the Chicano movement in the late 60s and 70s, Chicanos fought against this and said, we want to be recognized for what we are. But Fray Angélico was doing this in the 20s, 30s, 40s, way before the Chicano movement was doing it. And so when he moves to Cincinnati at the young age of 14, he takes the train across the country with the Archbishop Dager, who was going to Cincinnati to consecrate the new seminary building there. So this poor little 14-year-old leaves his family and goes to the Germanic seminary there. He's the only Hispano. And what I argue is he re-territorializes himself as an ethnic person, an ethnic subject, through his painting and his writing in the 1920s and 30s. And he continued research and writing on Hispanos in New Mexico for 7 decades, starting in the 1920s. So here he's dressed as a gaucho for the Santa Fe Fiesta, and he did this both in 1926 and 1928, and he won the first prize for the costume, and Witter Binner provided him with a prize, and that was how he came into contact with the writers group. But he's a kind of pan-Latino here because he's bringing Argentine culture in. So who was Fray Angélico Chávez? As I said, his death in 1996 inspired, for me and Mario Garcia, an investigative journey over a decade into many literary sites, many research sites. One of the primary ones is the History Library in the Palace of the Governors, which is now named after him, the University of New Mexico Library, the Franciscan Archives in Cincinnati, even the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, where I live and work, had material. There's a letter from Witter Binner to him in Harvard, which I came across. And then, of course, Phyllis Morgan's wonderful bibliography, her bibliography of all the writings of Fray Angélico Chávez, which she has now updated and is out there and available for purchase today. That was a priceless research source that I couldn't have done this book without. And what I argue in the book is that the narrative of his life is intimately connected to all his voluminous writing. You can't understand one without the other. And I wanted to thank and acknowledge here the many, many people who knew Chavez, who gave interviews over the years. And these are just some of the names. Julia Silva and Father Guadalupe Rivera, who were from Chile and knew him. He was a missionary there when they were little. Darlene and Lorenzo Armijo of Peña Blanca, and many, many Bacas. Carlota Baca, who is here today. Bertil and Erlinda, who were students in grammar school in Peña Blanca and now live in Albuquerque. Jaime Baca, who's a deacon, gave us wonderful information. Here in Santa Fe, Marcia Muth, Roz Eisenberg, Jody Ellis, Malcolm Withers, Tim Birch, Emily Hughes, Saul Cohen, John Penn Lafarge, both of them are here today. Phyllis Morgan, of course. The recently deceased wonderful photographer Robert Martin, Jim Mariel, and then N. Scott Momaday sent a letter testifying to how Fray Angélico had inspired him when he was a young boy at Jemez. And Mark Simmons, of course, the great New Mexico historian. Pedro Rivera Ortega, who was his altar boy. Concha Ortiz was his cousin. Eliseo Rodriguez, the sexto pintor from the Cinco Pintores. Federico Vigil, another important artist. Connie Hernandez, who her mother and she helped to revive the Conquistadora Cofradia. Marina Ochoa, of course, who's carried on his work in the archives. Recently deceased Stuart Udall would have been here today. He comes to everything with Fray Angélico. Sabine Olivari, Donna Quasthoff, the wonderful sculptor of the church door, the cathedral doors, and the statue. Ambassador Frank V. Ortiz, Monica Sosaya. I can't name everyone, but you can quickly glance over in the Chavez clan, Fabian, Antonio, Nora, Francisco, Jose, Bernice, Mary, Consuelo, sorry for the extra O, Tom, and Teresa. And then his fellow priests, Father Salvador Arracon, Godfrey Blank, Crispin Butts, Bill Sanchez in Albuquerque, Gilbert Schneider, who was his provincial, Jacques Clark Robinson, the Jesuit Father Thomas Steele, Father Juan Romero, who's from Taos but lives in LA now, and Father Bernard Gerbus, who was his classmate. So Manuel Chavez, age 3, his family had moved to San Diego, where his father worked as a carpenter and a manager on the Panama Pacific Exhibition. And this is a picture of him in 1913. And they come back. The significance of the San Diego journey is that he discovers the legacy of Franciscanism there. He sees the statue of Fray Junipero Serra, and he sees the mission San Diego de Alcalá. And even though he was, age 4, where you're just starting to get your memories, he testified that this inspired a deep respect for Franciscanism in history. They come back in 1915 and settle in Mora, and here he is with his sister Martha at their first communion in 1917. And in 7th or 8th grade, Father Jerome Hesse is giving a mission in Mora, and he confesses to him, tells him that he wants to be a Franciscan. And Father Hesse invites him to come to Peña Blanca for the summer to see if that's what he wants and see. And Bertil and Baca and the others told us that he was making out of the dirt missions. He was making mission churches out of the dirt, playing. He's this little 13-year-old boy. And that prefigures that he would go on to build and restore the churches in New Mexico at the time. So in early September, late August 1914, he heads for the Cincinnati Seminary. Here's a picture of him with his biology book and his microscope. They had to dress up and wear suits. And it was a very lonely environment. They were, in terms of being an Hispano, being away from your place. Here he is with some of his classmates. I wish I had the name so I could name the classmate that you mentioned. Iggy was real tall. The second, I know he was real tall. That's what I think. Yeah, Angelico's here on the far right, and they had gone into town, I guess, to have some cake on a special occasion. So this is in his album, which is in the photo archives downstairs, and he called themselves the Cake Eaters of 1928. And so his father built this wonderful house on Acequia Madre. And he came home for the summer. Notice he's got his beret on already, 1928. And he captioned this in his album, "From me down to Tony, Jose does not yet exist." Poor Jose is here today. He exists very much, but at this time he didn't. And his mother, you can see on the end, but the way the children are lined up and so on. And here he is wearing the gaucho costume in 1926, and I already talked about that. But it's a sign of his hybrid identity. So he meets members of the Santa Fe Writers Group, Witter Binner, Haniel Long, Thornton Wilder, and they take him under their wing. He goes to parties with them. They publish his first book after he's come home. He visited occasionally during the summer, but after he's back in taking up the ministry at Peña Blanca, they publish his first book, Clothes with the Sun, of his poetry. And they pick primarily his religious poetry, not his poetry about the Southwest, which is very interesting because this group wrote so much about the Southwest. Now, when he was coming home during the summers, he did wonderful paintings. And I should backtrack a little. He goes to the new seminary in Cincinnati, and the walls are bare, and he's allowed to do a painting of St. Francis on the seminary wall. And he also does a very transgressive painting of San Antonio, of St. Anthony, and he paints the face of Dolores del Rio into the figure of St. Anthony, the famous, beautiful Mexican movie star of the period. And of course, the superiors are going, what? Gender violations, sacred and profane, whatever you want to do, by all kinds of borders being crossed there. But I think he was trying to assert his Hispano identity, that he identified with this Mexican movie star. So he paints local scenes when he comes home for the summer, and one in particular was by East Garcia, and he depicts in this painting, which I'll show you in a minute, the Chapel of El Delirio, which was the Amelia White estate, and now it's the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe. And then he gives the painting to his aunt, Aurelia Roybal King, in appreciation for her sending him spending money. And this is a black and white reproduction of it. It exists in beautiful, the museum has it now, and it exists in a beautiful color reproduction. But you can see his early talent as an artist. And this is a painting that his niece One of his favorite nieces named after him, Maria Angélica, Mary Chavez, very important person in Santa Fe. And her parents passed this painting down to her on Acequia Madre. And this is not their house, but it was a scene that he saw there, that he's painting when he comes home from the seminary a few times. August 1929, he becomes a novice, and he undergoes tonsure, and his head is shaved. And precisely at this time that they're asking him to give up his worldly identity after all these years, he begins to very, very strongly assert his ethnic identity and his New Mexican identity. And he writes a number of poems and short stories published in the religious magazines there and his high school magazines. And while he's at the novitiate in Mount Airy, he publishes 10 illustrated stories using his given name, Manuel Chavez. And he asserts his Hispano ethnic identity, and he shows the influence of the Santa Fe Writers Group. So this is an illustration from one of those stories, Notch 21, about Billy the Kid, as he writes it in the book. It's a wonderfully funny story, but it's terribly sophisticated because there's on the mirror behind the bar, you can see who's coming in through the door, and he plays on mistaken identity and tricks, and I really invite you to read these stories. We've reproduced them now in this book that came out last fall called Guitars and Adobes, his first novel, and these uncollected stories. And he did 13 other additional stories at the height of the Depression while he was studying, is this the wrong? Yes. Holy Family Seminary in Oldenburg, Indiana. Father Jack pointed out that mistake to me. And these were stories for young female readers. They were lessons in love, courage, and faith, and he used a lot of humor and sophisticated wordplay. And he used female pseudonyms for a number of these stories. So I just wanted to show you his pseudonyms very quickly. One of the most famous ones is F. Chalmers Ayers. And there he uses the same letters of his own name, including the CH, which is a single letter in the Spanish alphabet, and went under that sort of so pretentious British-sounding name. And that was for his first novel, Guitars and Adobes, which he published in serialized form in St. Anthony Messenger magazine, and now is available in book form, finally, after all these years. He also used the pseudonym, the pen name, Arthur Chapman in the story Beads, and that thanks to the internet, I found out that was a little-known Southwestern author of cowboy poetry who died in 1935, so that's probably where he picked that name out. And then the wonderful female name that Nazario Garcia mentioned this morning, Angelico. He used that for 3 stories. And I was in Dublin last year giving a talk, and sure enough, on the wall of the hotel was a plaque to a woman named Angelico. And it turned out, I said, this is just fate that I'm staying in this hotel. And she was the 19th century Irish educator who establishes colleges for women in Dublin in the 19th century, so I don't know if he knew about it. And then Monica Lloyd for the story Winnie the Breadwinner in St. Anthony. Now, often he used these pseudonyms when he had other contributions in the same magazine, and probably the editor told him, we can't have too much by Fray Angélico Chávez or Manuel Chavez in the same magazine, and he creatively invented these nom de plumes. All right, so this is the wonderful Guitars and Adobe. He'd become friends with the great artist Gerald Cassidy, and he did lithographs for all of these stories, which are reprinted in the book Guitars and Adobe now. It was published between 1931 and 32, and this is the main one, just to show you the logo about this is the guitar that whoever touches it will die. And they think, according to the people in the story, think that Archbishop Lamy touched it right before he died, and so that's why he died. But I invite you to read it. So finally, in 1937, he's given a dispensation. He gets to come home to Santa Fe to be ordained. Goes back to the seminary for a couple more weeks till the school year was over. And he begins his first ministry in Peña Blanca. He created this ordination card in brown ink on slightly brown paper. And in it, he asks on the back in Latin, quid retribuam Domine, what do we give back to God? And he depicts the first Mass after the Vargas reconquest with one of his own ancestors holding La Conquistadora. And so when he celebrates his first Mass and makes this card, he's emphasizing his own role in New Mexico history. He already sees himself as a part of New Mexico history. So he's stationed at Peña Blanca from 1937 to 1943, and I call this a kaleidoscope of culture in his life. He's young, 27. He gives it all. He does a tremendous amount of work, and it's an amazingly fruitful period in terms of his artistic work in painting. So he ministered to Santo Domingo and the other nearby pueblos, and at that time Santo Domingo was under an interdict. It was being punished by the Archbishop, because they had told a Franciscan that he couldn't say Mass on a particular day because they were celebrating some other feast. And Fray Angélico Chávez managed to negotiate, just like his father. I was noticing his brother Fabian Chavez has tremendous negotiating skills as a politician, and I learned that his father Fabian Sr. also had tremendous negotiating skills. And Fray Angélico, in his early years, was able to get the Indians, to get the interdict lifted and masses and services to begin again on the pueblos. He renovated churches in this period. He painted murals. He published his first books in creative writing, all while working in full-time religious ministry. In September 1937, he began the renovation of Santa Dorotea Chapel with the help of 14 families who lived. And he painted images. This is what it looked like before the renovation, and this is what it looked like after. And he painted the images of Saint Jerome and Saint Albert as these two figures in honor of Father Jerome Hesse, who was his mentor, and Archbishop Albert Dager, who was his bishop, who was his minister. He was his provincial in the cathedral at the time. He was bishop. Yes, he was archbishop. Yeah, the first Franciscan archbishop of Santa Fe. And they came to the ceremonies, and allegedly Father Jerome refused to bless them. He said, I can't bless my own picture, and Father Angélico did it. And then he began his work of the paintings in the interior spaces of the Peña Blanca Church, and this is his famous picture of the Stigmata of San Francisco. And here's a triptych of the life of St. Francis. He did it in several panels. And then shortly thereafter, he began renovating the church at Peña Blanca, and here he is painting the crucifixion triptych in front of, sitting on the scaffolding with the paint. And as you know, as you heard, and most people know, he painted the townspeople into the faces of the people. A woman whose daughter had died came in one day while he was painting and showed him a picture, Rebecca, and she had died in childbirth. Fray Angélico also wrote a poem, a beautiful poem about Rebecca, To Rebecca Dead. And in it he said, the town ridiculed you, made fun of you because you were pregnant, and after you were dead, they all came to your funeral and were nice, but they didn't treat you nice in life. And this mother came in and brought him a picture of Rebecca, and she said, could you paint it into the picture? And that gave him the idea to paint not only Rebecca, but others as well. So he carved the wooden door there, and the front doors of the church he carved. He was terribly disappointed that those were just discarded after the church was torn down. As I said, this was a period of prolific writing, art, and renovation, and his work came together all of a piece. He participated in social and literary events with the Santa Fe Writers Group and the artists, and they published his first book of poetry, Clothed with the Sun, and 1939. And he also then published poetry, stories, and essays in local and wider national venues. So in 1938, they were having these poets roundups to raise money for Indian causes, and they invited him to be part of it. They went on for about 7 years in the 30s and up until the war. And here he is in the back row, and next to him is Peggy Pond Church, Grace Meredith, Alice Corbin Henderson, Janice Decay, Dorothy Bell Flanagan, William Dillon, and in the front row, Josephine Pinckney, Will Schuster, Haniel Long, Thornton Wilder, and Witter Binner. So this helped to establish his relationship with Thornton Wilder, and he wrote the poem Peña Blanca in response to Thornton Wilder's play Our Town, and had correspondence with him as well. Now, he signs up to be a chaplain in the service, and I think you saw this wonderful picture that we have extant of him performing last rites in the Philippines. He's the figure on the left there. And his correspondence that he wrote to his provincials in Cincinnati tells an an amazing story of how difficult it was to be in the war. He would lie in the camp. It would be pouring down rain. He'd be wet, and he'd write poems. He wrote articles. He was tremendously prolific. It was a very hard time for him. He was very small, and he was allowed to come home on a leave because he was down to 90 pounds or whatever. And he thought it was a temporary leave. But when he got back, they stalled him for a few months. They weren't sending anyone back because they were about to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he did not have to return. So he comes back as chaplain major, and he publishes a second book of poetry, 11 Lady Lyrics. And these were poems, a lot of which he'd written on the front in the Philippines. And then a major change in his life, he begins historical research that would predominate for the rest of his career. And here he is in 1949 conducting historical research in the History Library. He found in this research that his ancestors had been involved in the devotion to La Conquistadora. And he starts to talk to the women of the parish where they had fallen out of practice a little bit. And he helps them to revive the cofradia and the processions down to Rosario every summer, where you can see they're here. Robert Martin took this photograph, and he's in the back on the left there. And Connie Hernandez, who runs the old Santa Fe Trail religious shop, is there, the woman next to the little altar boy. And her mother made beautiful gowns for the Conquistadora. Now, I want to mention his lifelong contributions to St. Francis Cathedral. I see that they're having a conference on St. Francis Cathedral for the 400th and I don't see anything about him on the conference program. I hope, Jack Clark Robinson will talk about this a little, but his legacy is there. First of all, he wrote, and as soon as he comes back, they ask him to please write this book, the famous historical book on the history of the cathedral, the Cathedral of the Royal City of the Holy Faith of St. Francis, 1947. And today the book is just called the Santa Fe Cathedral of St. Francis of Assisi, but it's a major book. He revised it several times to continue it. Anyone who wants to know anything about the cathedral and Catholicism in New Mexico can learn from that. As I said, he revived the cofradia. He wrote 2 books on the La Conquistadora, and in 1948 he made the amazing discovery that the statue had come in 1625, and it was Our Lady of the Assumption, not after the Pueblo Revolt in 1693, as was believed at the time. So he's a major revision of history at that point. And then in 56 and 57, he took on a major redesign of the Conquistadora Chapel as we know it today. And he got new reredos. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a minute, from 2 side altars. And then in the mid-1980s, he participated in the renovation of the cathedral. He designed the new altar screen, which is there. He chose the saints, and he did drawings of what all the saints should look like. And they were later executed, painted by another artist. And he also returned the statue of St. Francis, which was in the chapel of San Francisco at Golden, which is now in a niche in the altar screen. And he designed the cathedral doors depicting the history of the church in New Mexico since 1539, which Donna Quasthoff executed. So I wanted to just show you the picture of the Conquistadora Chapel as we know it today. It was dark. There was a statue of the Sacred Heart. It didn't look at all like this, and he got the gold leaf painted on these 2 side altar screens that he piled one on top of the other. And so his legacy is there in the cathedral, and Archbishop Sheehan mentioned that at his funeral. All right, in 1956, he came out to L.A. and did a TV program called The Catholic Hour at NBC Studios with Paul Horgan. And they interviewed each other about their books, and Paul Horgan interviewed him about La Conquistadora. They were good friends, and Fray Angélico did a lot of research to help Paul Horgan. The key literary and history texts of his in the 1950s are Origins of New Mexico Families, 1954, which is still in print and so useful to so many in New Mexico. From an Altar Screen, Stories with an Illustration by Peter Hurd, 1957. The Virgin of Port Ligat, which was praised by T.S. Eliot as an amazing poem based on a painting of Salvador Dalí. And he had trouble publishing that. He had to go through all sorts of hurdles you go through what's called censorship to get the imprimatur. And some in the Franciscan order thought that this was a scandalous painting by Salvador Dali, and how could you write a religious poem about it? But he was innovative, and he saw the potential there, and he finally was able to get it published. And then The Lady from Toledo, which he did his own illustrations for in 1960. So he becomes pastor at Cerrillos in 1960, and he immediately takes on the renovation of the chapel at Golden, which Tom Chavez interviewed him on, and the church bell was gotten from the railroad company. But it's a beautiful, you can just, he called it a sermon in stone, okay? He said because passersby from the highway would be able to see this, and it would be a sermon talking to them. And he was picking a turn of phrase from Shakespeare when he said that. He retires from the priesthood, as we heard, in 1971 to become a full-time writer. He was known around town with his beret and his beads, and he began to focus on history in the final decades. My Penitente Land is his magnum opus, innovatively connecting New Mexico Catholic history to the Holy Land in Spain. Dozens of articles and reviews for New Mexico Magazine, The Song of St. Francis, The Lord in New Mexico, which Robert Sanchez paid him to do and commissioned him to do. And then one of his most important last contributions. The 3 volumes that we know as, there are 3 separate volumes now on Padres Martinez, Gallegos, and Ortiz, were originally an 800-page manuscript which he entitled Truth Stalks the Archbishop, to do a play on Willa Cather's title. And he realized that he had to try and publish that in 3 separate volumes, which he eventually did. And then his final book, Chavez, A Distinctive American Clan of New Mexico. He dies in March 1996 after having returned to St. Francis Friary. His immediate family, 1959 at the parents' golden wedding anniversary. And for people who are here today, Jose is on the left in the back, and Fabian is in the center, and of course his dear parents seated. Cuate's on the right. We don't have time to go over all of them. I wanted to just briefly go over a little bit of the gems of Fray Angélico Chávez's humor. Could write several articles on it. Well, I don't even need to read them because you can read them there. As for the army uniform, I know that I look much better in the seraphic habit, which covers a multitude of shins. And then in July 1971, he sent a letter to Eleanor Adams, the historian at the University of New Mexico. He was doing research with her. I lost my car with my habit. Or rather, I am now a genuine friar in Caballo de San Francisco. Hence, I can no longer take off for Albuquerque. And then in 1954 letter to Father Edgar Casey, what follows is what he wrote in the letter. Overheard, Monsignor Buchanan, listening to Fray Angélico's somewhat Celtic brogue. Father Chavez, are you all Spanish or Mexican? Father Angélico, oh no, I'm part Scotch. Monsignor Buchanan, you don't say, what clan may I ask? Father Angélico, Ballantines. And then in 1954, he made a very, very arduous pilgrimage over 3 months all over the state of New Mexico, bringing La Conquistadora. And he wrote an article to chronicle what he'd done for the Provincial Chronicle, and he signed it Father Angélico instead of O.F.M. 5 C's, C. And he said that the 5 C's symbolize Chavez, consignator, chauffeur, courtier, conquistadore, a little Latin there. And he says he was very tired, describing his fatigue during this 3 months with the statue. And then he says, I became so tired toward the end in my trips that I used to converse with Our Lady in the back seat. A psychiatrist would have had a field day if he'd heard me. There was no audible backseat driving. So it's very sophisticated humor. And then on a birthday card to Arnie Withers, Malcolm Withers' husband, he made a little poem. There was a heath man named Withers, whose with was a bother with dithers. When told to be gone, either hither or yon, said, pith on your yawns and your hithers. And then he signs it, Chavez Pier. And then in 1963, he received the Brotherhood Award from the Conference of Christians and Jews. And in his acceptance speech, he said, I was born a Goy and a pagan, but became a Christian when I was baptized. I also became somewhat of a Jew, for the name given me was Emmanuel, and so my boyhood pals called me Manny Chavez. Whence the name of the famous kosher wine? I suppose you think that's the reason for this award. I thank you. And then, following up on that joke, there was a letter to Phyllis Morgan from Jean Lyon, who published the bibliography of their work. He says, saw the little angel. Oh, they had wonderful... After he left the order, he had a wonderful group of friends, and they called him the little angel and other such nicknames. And he said, saw the little angel a few weeks ago at an autographing party and mentioned that we were doing your book. He seemed suitably pleased. Also looked in fine spirits and health. As an aside, to his personal friends, he's known as Angel Baby, a nickname he seems to enjoy. But he has his own name joke, Manischewitz. Manny plus Shevitz. And then Donna Kwastov's sculpture of Chavez after a snowfall holding the book and the single rose, and we've heard so much about that today. He actually wrote the poem, The Single Rose, before World War II, and he was not able to get permission from the Archbishop to publish it. He was having some disagreements with the Archbishop, and he was afraid to even turn it in. So he didn't publish it until after he came back, but it's a wonderfully appropriate image for the statue. So I would end by talking about him as a unique 20th century American writer. We can ethnicize him and say he was an Hispano writer, but I see him as part of the American literary canon. His vast intellectual and artistic contributions helped to recenter Hispano culture within the American mainstream. He experienced hybrid identity formation decades before the Chicano movement. His ethnicity connected to religion, art, literature, and history. He participated in key moments of American history, the Depression, World War II, Vatican Council II, global history. And he always insisted on connecting the present to the past. He carefully researched and wrote revisionist history for both scholars and the wider public. He published hundreds of reviews and articles in New Mexico Magazine, for example, in the 1970s. So through his historical research, his ministry, and church renovation, he, in a sense, became the early friars from the colonial period. He performed his role in history while he researched and documented it for posterity. And that really is evident. He wanted to make sure that everything was documented, just as he was able to find out about the history of the 15th, 16th, and 17th century from the records that the early Franciscan friars had left. So to end on this special day, 100 years ago, this is the only picture I have of his wonderful parents, Maria Nicolasa and Fabian Chavez, on their 50th wedding anniversary. And they produced a son. They nurtured him. Of course, he had native intelligence, but their upbringing and formation also helped to make him what he was. All right, thank you.
If it's okay with you, we'll take a little break. And I would hope that you will return and we can talk with the panel. Again, as I introduced earlier this morning, we would like to hear from you. We have a cordless microphone, and we also would like you to ask questions to the panel. So thank you, Hazel. And if you could please consider filling out the questionnaire. And if you don't have this anymore, you can also do it online. It is on our palaceofthegovernors.org library page. Just 2 clicks away. Or any stories for that matter. Like I say, I really would like to hear some stories from the audience. I wished I would have written them down when I heard them, but now we would record them. Yeah. Mr. Chavez, there's another chair for you.
I was laughing at myself when it was showing some works of paintings about to tell you the truth, when I used to hitchhike from Santa Fe to Playa Blanca, the only painting that really impressed me was the reception of the Stigmata by St. Francis. Very impressive. As far as the rest of the work he was doing, I got the idea that I had a brother that couldn't stand a blank wall. And then from reading what was written about paintings that he did around the seminary, doing the same thing. I think Manuel could not stand a blank wall. That's my confession.
I had one question written down because Penn had to leave, and I'm not sure who should answer it, but please expand on or elaborate on what alienated Fray Angélico from the Franciscan order and from the church. Hold on, we'll go around, yeah, sorry.
Well, from reading his correspondence, they wrote faithfully back and forth for all the decades that he was in. He felt unappreciated. He felt that, and his superiors were very kind, but he felt that he didn't have enough time to do his writing and that people didn't really appreciate his work. Other Franciscans didn't buy his books and so on. And it gradually became more and more. There were also tensions, normal living tensions that any group living together has, in Blanca or anywhere else. He had to say 3 masses on Sundays, trinate as they called it, and he had to go on missions. It was a very, very, very hard work. And it built up over the years so that in the 1960s and 70s, he began to see it in the context of colonialism. And he talked about, in his letter of resignation, he said, I feel that we Hispanos are victims of ecclesiastical colonialism. That is to say that we're not given our due, we're not seen as real people. So it's a combination of ordinary tensions, everyday living, not having enough time to do all you want to do, feeling you're unappreciated, both by the archdiocesan hierarchy and the Franciscan hierarchy at some times, that led to his leaving. But in the wonderful stories that we had from Father Jack, we see that he always conceived of himself as a Franciscan, and after 20-some-odd years, he returned and kept that Franciscan identity and was there when he died.
I totally agree with everything that you said there, Ellen. And what I would add to it is simply, we're going to tie you in a knot
that's
here.
okay.
I would add to it, there is a saying that religious life, and especially Franciscan community, is a group of people living together and tormenting one another for the love of God. And that is what our ordinary day-by-day life sometimes can seem like it is. And so those tensions, and then being something of a little bit of a mixed bag among the friars myself, in terms of that I'm not only about sacramental ministry. I'm not only, and I'm especially not only about parochial administration and things like that. I can certainly say that gets to you after a while. It really does get to you in terms of a sense of, some people say that you really appreciate that I do this and I do that in terms of our history, and they're never afraid to ask you to, would you write this, would you write that, would you write the other thing? And but at the same time, we have this job and that job and the other job we want you to do. So as I say, I actually, the gentleman approached me on his way out, and I said, I think it was a matter of finally there was a straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't a one-time.
Father Jack.
Hold on.
Father, do you think that Vatican II and the changes of the Church were actually the straw that broke the camel's back?
I think the fact that the Church didn't change as much as he had hoped and wanted and longed for it to in becoming more scripturally based. I think Ellen does a wonderful job of pointing out, and then when I went back and reread my Penitente Land, it's so steeped in a kind of a scriptural understanding there that I think, Consuelo, you're right, that Vatican II had an impact, but in this case it wasn't that things changed, it was that they didn't change perhaps as much or as fast as he thought they should change.
I have a little question. I just wanted to, if someone could clarify, it was unclear to me whether Fray Angélico was the first Hispano Franciscan priest ordained in New Mexico, or in so many hundred years, or the first Hispano priest. And I understood maybe you meant Franciscan, but I didn't know.
Yes, it's Franciscan. I'm sorry if I confused you, because obviously we had...
There were just kind of interruptions, so
He's the first Franciscan, the first native Hispano ordained a Franciscan priest in 300 years, over 300 years. Because the other priests were diocesan priests, the three from the 19th century.
Jack wants to say.
If I could add just a little bit on that in defense, I don't mean it actually defensively, but as an explanation, in part, during the colonial times, the Spanish civil law said that no one could enter a religious community or be ordained until they were third generation Christian. So that meant that the Franciscans who came here could not by law receive any of the Native Americans who actually were converted or until they were third generation. And so with that, the Pueblos learned a lesson they weren't supposed to learn, which is the unintended lesson, which is we're not supposed to become Franciscans. And so that's why to this day, that is still a prevalent thought among Franciscans. There was a Cochiti Indian, a native of Cochiti, who went off to the miners' seminary in the 1930s and who died under mysterious circumstances on a home visit after coming back. I mean, the thought was very prevalent that, I mean, it just became the accepted thing. We're not supposed to become Franciscans among the Native Americans. And then, of course, in the period between the 1840s, when the Mexican independence came, the Mexican government, out of, if you will, a cautionary or a fear of the Franciscans who were so tied to Spain, exiled and said that a number of friars had to leave New Mexico. It was only the elderly ones who could stay, or the ones who had been in Mexico for so long. And so that's when the number, and Bob Wright of the Oblate in San Antonio has written on this, on what is a few number of friars. But anyway, the friars, actually there were more friars here and more diocesan when Lamy arrived, or excuse me, there was only, the last friar had just died when Lamy arrived. But they didn't decrease quite as fast at the end of the colonial era as people presume. But again, it was a legal thing. It was the government that was running the show. And so there were no Franciscans between 1848 and 1900 in New Mexico. There were none, except for secular Franciscans and except for the Franciscans. So that's why there were, and at that time then, there could have been men joining the Franciscans, but there were no Franciscans to join. And so it was in 1900 when they came back to Peña Blanca after 1898 out at St. Michael's, Arizona. But in 1900 they came to Peña Blanca, and from that it was really actually relatively quick that that Angelico, and then Angelico broke the ice because you have Salvador Aragon, you have others who start to come to the friars.
I want to add something to this. There was a secular priest, a New Mexican, who was ordained, Santiago Roybal, and Angelico was very proud to write about him, research. He found this, and he was named the vicar for the Archbishop and sent up here in the 1700s, second half of the 18th century. Was an ancestor of Fray Angélico. And so that was the first native priest, and by native I mean just somebody born here, to be named. I want to do a nuance on the three-generation thing. Certainly, Angelico's ancestors from the day they got here had 3 generations of Christianity behind them. And the point of him being the first Franciscan is that there were a lot of eligible men to be Franciscans. Granted, no one from New Mexico that I know of petitioned to be a Franciscan. That's the different thing. If you're crazy enough to come here, why would you do that anyway? So, doubly crazy. There's a double jeopardy. Though the Franciscans at that time were coming out of Spain, the Canary Islands, they were being trained in Mexico. I just heard a paper the other day, and I've got to share this with my father of what their regimen was and everything. But for example, the Jesuits did have native-born priests, criollos to be sure, meaning descendants of Spanish people, but they did. Whereas the Franciscans kept coming from Spain.
There were Creole Franciscans in Mexico too, obviously.
There's a question here.
Okay, if this is too far afield, then disregard it or just give it a real short answer. But I was just curious about the Spanish civil law that you said that pertained to the Franciscans. Did it also pertain to the Jesuits or any other religious order?
Well, I mean, the Spanish crown was running the shots, or he was calling the shots among religious communities, to the instance that the Jesuits were expelled from the Spanish Empire in the 18th century. It went to everybody.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is more of a comment than anything, but I'll address this to Alan and also to Father Jack. One of the beautiful things about your book, I think it takes great guts to write about someone who so many people remember, and the characters in your book, not the characters, but the real people that so many of us knew. And one of the most poignant points in that book, I thought, was when I just unexpectedly came upon the story of Roberto Sanchez and what he had done. And it really touched my heart when you said that you got to see him, speak with him. I didn't know if you could tell us where you got to speak to him, and also if there was anyone, because of the beautiful story that you told about, he held up Angélico Chávez to such a great degree, inspired him, made him go on. I was just sort of hoping that you would be able to say that there was such an individual for Archbishop Sanchez.
I'm a bit on a spot here. I did the interviews in Arizona, where I can say this much: Archbishop Sanchez was living with a very supportive community.
Thank you. Thank you.
A very supportive community that wears brown.
I'd like to ask a slightly political question to Fabian. Fabian, over here. Fabian, can you tell us, how did Fray Angélico feel in 1960, if you remember, about the election of the first Catholic president in the United States, John Kennedy? And maybe Tom can share something if he knows it as well. How did Fray Angélico react to the first Catholic president being elected in the United States? Did he share any reflections on that with you?
No, he did not, beyond the fact that he was delighted that the good Democrat got elected. Angélico was like me. I don't know about the rest of the family, but we were FDR Democrats. I still am. And that was it. No, I was, as a working politician, I was delighted, of course, and it gives me a chance to tell a secret. As we campaigned around the North, and we'd say, now, you are going to vote for Kennedy, aren't you? A subtle way of campaigning, but But no, he never. I imagine, knowing him, he would not have voted for Kennedy if he was a Republican. But being a Catholic and a Democrat, pretty good.
We went to lunch, and I asked my Uncle Fabian, I said, you forgot to say what Angelico called my mother. And he couldn't remember if, he said, well, he had a lot of respect for my mother and so on. But I do remember one time, any of you who've been to the Chavez house on Acequia Madre, there was a beautiful bird bath that had come out of Archbishop Lemie's the Archbishop's garden by the cathedral. I don't remember how Angelico got it, but he brought it home, and Grandma and Grandpa let him put it in the front yard, and it was fine, but it didn't work for years. And after Fray Angélico left the Franciscans, he came home to my mother and lived in the back room and wanted to be helpful. So she came home from lunch one day, and there was a trench dug from the fountain to a source of water on the east side of the property. And he was connecting the fountain so it would work. And my mother came out, and I have never heard expletives from my mother's voice as I did that day. And he just looked at her, he covered the hole up, went back into the house, and never did another thing in the house or on the property. But I just remember when the La Conquistadora statue was stolen. I had made a banner. I was working at the cathedral in those days in music, and I was making a banner for some feast day, and all of a sudden there was a knock at the back door, and there were some men, I don't know if it was from the Santa Fe Police Department or from the FBI, whoever they called in, and they showed their badge, and I said, well, what's going on? We need to see Angelico's room. I said, well, why? We just need to see Angelico's room, and I never thought of asking for a search warrant, so I showed them the room, and they looked under the bed, and they looked in this small closet, they looked over everything, and they said, it's clean. And I said, yeah, it's clean. What are you looking for? Someone had told them to look in the back room at the Chavez house for La Conquistadora. Can you imagine if she had been there, what I would have thought? But they thought that they thought he had absconded with her and had her in the back room at the Chavez house.
Anybody else? Then, I have a microphone. Okay. Then I would like to just well, it had to be in the back.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I just wanted to ask, did Fray Angélico see himself as a sort of St. Francis of Assisi for northern New Mexico?
Not in my mind.
In the sense for that he was looking towards a renovation of the church for the Hispanic people.
Not a St. Francis of New Mexico, but he was a man. He adored St. Francis. He was proud to be a Franciscan. He wrote about St. Francis. One of his more popular and attractive publications was one that he wrote, history of St. Francis for younger children to read. He was a dedicated Franciscan, but no, he never considered himself being holy in any way. He was just a Franciscan priest, a writer, an artist, and he didn't consider himself an artist. He didn't think he was a hot shot as a writer. I mean, he was really the great things you're saying about him. He'd be the last guy to brag about him. As a matter of fact, he didn't want to hurt family. When he decided that he was going to take a break from the Franciscans, the way he let me do it after having a sip of good Chavez Regal Scotch. He says, I want you to know, Junior, that that's complimentary. I am Fabian Jr., but only the family was allowed to call me that. Yeah. So you'll know ahead of time, I've decided to retire, and I wrote Provincial in Cincinnati and the Archbishop here in Santa Fe, that since generals and corporals and sergeants and army people can retire after 30 years, certainly I can do the same. And that's how he let me know he was taking a break.
Saul Cohen has a question.
No.
Comment.
I'm reluctant to make the comment. It's just that the wonderful presentations today have brought back so many recollections of Fray Angélico that I'm kind of brimming over with them, as many of you probably are. I'll limit myself to just three. They all kind of reflect aspects of Fray Angélico that we heard today. The first one is that I'm probably the only person here who appeared in one of his articles, but he wrote an article for New Mexico Magazine, and he said he was on the plaza and he ran into his friend Saul Cohen, and he said, do you realize that tortillas and matzah are connected? And he went on from there, and that was the whole substance of the article. The second thing I want to mention, also reflected in prior comments, is he was getting an award from the King of Spain. I forget what it was here. And as always, in those occasions, there were speeches. And if you kept your eye on Fray Angélico, he was getting more and more impatient. And he was getting angry, and I was afraid he was going to blow up before the speech was finished. But finally they stopped, and he got up and said something. But he was ready to stalk off the platform. He was just so fed up with all this talk, because he really was, I don't know if the word modesty has been mentioned, but synonyms for it, he really was modest. And the third thing I'd like to mention is that I was on a bus in California with a Monsignor Francis Weber that you may know, who's a historian, and I'm a member of a book collectors club called the Zamorano Club, and we got to talking, and he found out I was from Santa Fe, and I said, did you ever know a Fray Angélico Chávez? He said, no, I never knew him, but he was nominated to be Archbishop, and I saw whatever the form was, but he obviously was not appointed. And later, back in Santa Fe, next time I ran into Fray Angélico, I mentioned it and said, did you know that you were up for Archbishop? And he said, oh, yeah, but Archbishop, I forget the name, was one of the prior archbishops. He never liked me. I knew I could never make it. But he was a wonderful man.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you.
I can add to the medal. It was the Reina Católica medal given by the government of Spain. Very prestigious thing. A Spanish diplomat named Jose Ramacha from the Spanish embassy contacted the museum. He knew me, helped me get a couple of grants to go to Spain, but he started reading Angélico's books and went to his government and said, this man deserves it. And I was there. I emceed that program. I remember he was saying things to me under his breath. Actually, I was sitting or standing by him. I can't remember which. And that award was given to him in Tom's library.
I have a question for Melina. You, as a young scholar who obviously became attracted to researching Fray Angélico, but what would you say is the attraction of Fray Angélico to a new generation of intellectuals, especially Hispanic intellectuals like here in New Mexico? What's the attraction for him of him now to a new generation of scholars and intellectuals, would you say?
Well, yeah, that's true. Students do say he's good looking when they see pictures of him when he was a youth. in his youth. But I think I would have to say it's the way he writes history. It's very, people can understand it, relate to it in a different way. Like I said, I came across his work reading La Conquistadora, which is, a very playful narrative, but also relates a lot of, historical facts. But also, I think, a religious faith and feeling that a lot of New Mexican Hispanic students relate to. I don't think that they necessarily know that that's what they're relating to, but I think that's certainly something that underpins his work. And one of my fellow students at the University of New Mexico had actually read La Conquistadora in catechism class. So, his work isn't just, it's not just, it doesn't just relate to the scholarly realm. It extends beyond that. And I think that is really an attraction for a lot of younger people. He writes in different voices, different representative modes, and, I think that says a lot, and that speaks to a lot of different people on different levels. So, that's the way I would characterize him.
Hi. I was new to New Mexico, and I never met him. But one day I was sitting at La Fonda, one of those comfortable chairs, and he came and sat next to me, and he says, "How are you?" And I said, "Fine, thank you." And I said, "How are you?" And he says, "Oh, I'm just sitting around waiting for my time to be up."
Thank you.
That reminds me of another La Fonda episode. Sam Ballon. Sam Ballon, the owner of the hotel, and Angélico became very good buddies. Angélico would spend hours and hours sitting at the La Fonda lobby watching people and smoking his cigars. And one time I walked in there, and he and Sam Ballon were visiting. And Sam said that he had gotten the merchants around the plaza to put up some money so they could light up the cathedral at nighttime to see how beautiful it was. It was dark all the time, and it needed to be lighted up so that people could really appreciate it at nighttime. And so they did that. And Sam, who was of Jewish faith, a merchant, successful Santa Fean, was bragging about raising the money for it. And Father Angélico said that's it. What Sam's telling you is correct, and we call them the Israelites.
If that, is this thing on? Yeah. If this is it, then I have one comment to make, and that is the most used book in the Fray Angélico Chávez library is really not a book. It is his 13 volumes of Roots, which is his archival work of all the people in New Mexico who got married from the 1600s on, I think, to 1850 or so. It was never really published with a publisher, but most of us in New Mexico, in the libraries, in Albuquerque, in Las Cruces, we all have a copy. That's probably the most used one of all of those books. Last, I wanted to just sort of ask, because it was part of the grant and also part of my hope to find out a little bit, what does it mean to be a New Mexican? And I was just wondering if you as a panel, one sentence, what do you think it meant to Fray Angélico to be a New Mexican? Just one sentence, and if it's too hard, we'll...
He was extremely proud of being a northern New Mexican. Now, I say that because in reality, as we were growing up, and I was the third youngest, and I'm the oldest one left. And I'm going to be 86 years old, so I cover a lot of territory. And down the southern part of New Mexico, the people with Hispanic background would call us northern boys manitos. And it wasn't meant as a compliment. And we knew that the history of northern New Mexico, isolated from the rest of the world for some 300 years, grew, in essence, a northern New Mexico culture. It's very distinctive, historically and otherwise. And he was very proud of that. I read that into Penitente land. Penitente land. Of all the works that he wrote, and I read every one of them, that one's the one that moved me the most because he exposed his soul in that book. And it shows how he felt about being a New Mexican. I said specifically northern New Mexican because he really writes it on the history of northern New Mexico.
I never had a conversation with him about what it means to be a New Mexican, and we just assumed that it was cool. And isn't it great to be a New Mexican? I might be reading some of myself into this, but I think he saw, a lot of his friends were not Hispanic, especially a lot of his bar mates and lunch mates. They weren't, and his supporters, to a great extent, were not, but they were New Mexicans to him. I think he had a broad term about New Mexicans, although he was fiercely proud of being a Hispanic New Mexican. He included a lot of people being New Mexicans. And in the end of his life, a lot of that, of what he wrote and said had to deal with, almost reflects what Ellen's shown in her book, his treatment in the church and so forth, that he took the Mexican priests, native clergy who went to Mexico and were ordained and then came back, and then, had to deal with Lamy and all the French, and then all the subsequent biased histories about Lamy and how Martinez and Gallegos were these kind of scandalous, priests that, weren't worthy of it. And one thing I want to correct Ellen in her book, because she gives me credit for the third. I finished the third of the trilogy, his last books. He asked me to finish that, and I thought I toned him down. I mean, he was really after him. I said, I can't say that, because he'd passed away, and I thought I toned him down. And Helen says, that gives me credit for being meaner than him in the last book. And I said, wow, but I will admit something, and Helen doesn't know this. There was a book written about Machibu, an apology about Machibu. And in that book, that author severely criticized Angélico and went in this whole psychological thing, trying to prove that he had all these hang-ups and problems and stuff. So I did get pissed off.
No, let's go.
Just want to comment on the meanness. It was that he was writing against Paul Horgan, his friend Paul Horgan, his version of Archbishop Lamy, the famous book. So in the first 2 volumes, he just said an author, and then you'd have to go to the footnote to see it. But in Tom's volume, he puts the name right there in the text, so everyone sees the attack on. That's what I meant.
Of the personal conversations that Angélico and I had, especially after he softened up and that both of us had good scotch, he told me on many occasions how disturbed he was about how some of the writers, fictional writers as well, had left in the impressions that they wrote of what New Mexico was like, which wasn't very complimentary. He mentioned specifically Willa Cather and Death Comes to the Archbishop, not only making Lamy look great, but making everybody around him, including the people of New Mexico, not very complimentary. And there were other writers that he mentioned to me that just passerby and would describe a person or persons or a community as being nothing but a dirty, dusty old place, not worthy looking or visiting with. And an individual, for example, he jumped to the defense of the Natules, where everybody, all the gringo writers, were trying to make a whore out of her. And he took exception to that, and you helped in cleaning that up. And so he was proud of being Northern New Mexican, and he did react and had a personal dislike for those writers who, writing about New Mexico, would describe it as being a dumpy place that's not worth visiting. And he shows that more than anything in My Penitente Land, where he describes what I felt was, for those of you who read Willa Cather, read this so you know what New Mexico is truly like.
I guess just to get back to the question, which was, what does it mean to be New Mexican? I guess the way that I would answer that would be to say that the religious faith is what it means to be New Mexican. And I don't mean, and I guess here I echo Father Jack's talk, that it's not connected to an institution or church dogma, but I think connected to the land and the landscape. And in that sense, it's much more open and it's not exclusive. So, it can incorporate other other faiths, other ethnicities besides, Hispanic and Catholicism. And, I think that's what attracted, many of the early writers in the 20th century, still attracts people today. But that also, makes it a very unique place, but also very universal at the same time.
As I mentioned, we all live our everyday culture and we don't think about it too much. But when you're 14 and you get transplanted out of that culture, then you start to look at it with different light. And so for him, in the early days in the seminary, to be New Mexican meant to write about the culture here, the traditions, the native peoples, the Hispano traditions, and so on. And he wrote about it in poetry and short stories and so on. And then the war experience, he thought he would work with the New Mexican boys, and he was assigned to a regiment out of New York, and he had no New Mexican boys to work with. So when he came home, he started researching New Mexico history. He was given an assignment on the Franciscan martyrs in the Pueblo Revolt to find out if they were really martyrs. That was the beginning of his historical research. And that's what I would say being New Mexican became for him in those later decades, researching about the history of New Mexicans, the religious history, primarily the Franciscan role. And as I was arguing, he became one of those early Franciscan friars. That was his New Mexicanness. Oh, and then I'll just add, Stuart Udall invited him to give Jackie Kennedy Onassis a tour of Santa Fe in New Mexico. So he was still, it was more than just the Franciscans. He was telling them all about the history and so on as an inside ethnographer as opposed to an outside ethnographer.
I believe that for Fray Angélico, being a New Mexican was in large measure about learning to walk in the sunshine on cold days and to seek the shadows on hot days. I believe for him that it was in large measure learning to appreciate the beauty of sharp shadows that were cast by the bright sunlight on some very sharp rocks. And that in those things, he found a way to live that was of a piece and at peace with this land, this beautiful, beautiful land, and the people who have grown strong in its winds and in its droughts and in its flash floods. that all of that was a part for him of what it meant to be a New Mexican.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I had fun. I hope you had too. Happy birthday, Fray Angélico.
And thank you, Tomas.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Angélico. Happy birthday to you.
Now, what about the mañanitas? Nobody.
These things off.
Estas son. Vengo a saludarte. Venimos todos juntos y pues a felicitarte. El día que tú naciste, nacieron todas las flores. Mismo cancionaron los ruiseñores. Viene amaneciendo, la luz del día ascensió. Levántate del mañana, mira que ya amaneció. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.